The grease was already popping when she reached for the flour. No recipe card, no measuring cup, just hands that had done this 10,000 times. Every biscuit and pie crust carried a trick inside it that nobody ever wrote down. Here are 30 oddly useful hillbilly baking tricks that actually work. Your grandmother did not just pour cornbread batter into a cold skillet. She put that cast iron in the oven first, empty, greased with nothing but a slick of bacon drippings, and let it get screaming hot while she mixed the batter. When she poured that wet cornmeal mixture into the pan, you heard it. That sizzle was the whole trick. The batter hit the hot iron and immediately formed a crust, golden, crisp, almost like a shell, while the inside stayed soft and tender. Without that preheat, cornbread sat flat with no character. With it, the edges pulled away with a crunch that could fill a quiet kitchen. This was standard across Appalachia and the Deep South from at least the 1930s, when cast iron was the only pan most families owned. A hardware trade guide from 1934 listed the hot skillet method as the only proper way. The pan had to be so hot that the grease inside was shimmering before the batter ever touched it. You preheated the iron or you did not make cornbread. There was a tin can beside every stove in every hill kitchen, sometimes a coffee can, sometimes a lard bucket with the label worn off, and it held bacon grease. Every morning after the bacon came out of the skillet, the drippings went into that can. That grease was the first thing to touch a baking pan, a muffin tin, a pie plate. You scooped it out with a spoon or a folded cloth and wiped it across the surface in one smooth pass. It did more than prevent sticking. It added a faint, smoky warmth to everything, a flavor that butter alone could not match. The grease from Tuesday's breakfast ended up in Saturday's biscuits. Kids grew up thinking that was just how food tasted, rich and deep and salted, and they were right. The day that family stopped saving drippings was the day the kitchen lost its signature. She put vinegar in the pie crust. Not much, a teaspoon, maybe a tablespoon if the dough was large, splashed right into the ice water before it went into the flour. If you asked her why, she could not tell you the science. She just knew her mother did it, and the crust came out tender every single time. The acid slows down gluten development, the protein network that makes dough tough and chewy. Less gluten meant a crust that shattered when you pressed a fork through it instead of bending. Apple cider vinegar was the most common. Hill kitchens always had a jug, but white vinegar worked the same. Some women added an egg to the ice water along with the vinegar, which made the dough easier to roll. You could not taste it in the finished pie. Not a trace. The vinegar disappeared in the oven, leaving behind nothing but flake after flake after flake. She never called it a trick. She called it the only way. If a recipe called for buttermilk and the jar was empty, nobody drove to the store. They poured a cup of sweet milk, dropped in a tablespoon of white vinegar, and let it sit on the counter for 10 minutes. The milk thickened slightly, went a little sour, and became something close enough to buttermilk that the biscuits could not tell. The acid curdled the milk proteins, giving the liquid enough tang to react with baking soda the way real buttermilk would. Lemon juice worked too, though lemons were scarce in mountain kitchens. This trick was so ordinary that most women did not think of it as a substitution. The real buttermilk, the kind from churning, had a complexity no shortcut could match. But vinegar and milk got the job done. Long before anyone reached for that vinegar jug or the bacon can, though, there was the lard. A heavy tin of it, white as snow, sat next to the stove in nearly every rural kitchen from the 1920s through the 1960s. Some families rendered their own after hog killing, cutting the fat into small pieces, cooking it low and slow until it melted clear, then straining it through cloth into containers that would last all winter. The best came from the leaf fat around the kidneys, which rendered cleaner and had almost no pork flavor. That was the baking lard. It went into pie crusts, biscuits, cake batters, and fried pies. It made pastry flakier than butter because of its crystalline structure. When it melted in the oven, it left behind tiny air pockets that puffed the dough into layers. Store-bought shortening replaced it by the 70s, and most kitchens never recovered the texture. When the potatoes finished boiling, the water did not go down the drain. It went into the bread. Potato water, starchy, cloudy, warm, was poured directly into dough in place of plain water, and the difference was immediate. The starch fed the yeast, giving it more sugar to eat, which meant a faster rise and a softer crumb. Loaves made with potato water stayed moist a full day longer than loaves made without. In the Appalachian Mountains, this trick went even further. Cooks used potato water to create salt-rising bread starters, fermenting sliced potatoes in warm liquid until wild bacteria produced enough gas to raise an entire loaf without commercial yeast. The earliest known recipe dates to 1778 from what was then the western frontier of Virginia. Pioneer women buried their starter pots in beds of heated rock salt to keep the temperature steady overnight. Nothing was wasted, not the potato, not the water, not the heat from the hearth. Before there was cake flour on a grocery shelf, there was a woman standing over a bowl with a hand-cranked sifter, running the same flour through it 3 times. The first pass broke up lumps. The second aerated the flour, filling it with tiny pockets of air that would make the cake lighter. The third, that was the one she swore by, blended everything so completely that the texture felt like silk between her fingers. This was not a suggestion in those kitchens, it was law. You sifted 3 times or you did not bake. All-purpose flour straight from the sack was too heavy for a proper layer cake, and self-rising flour needed the extra sifting to distribute the baking powder evenly. The sound of that sifter was a rhythm in the house, that quiet cranking and the soft hiss of flour falling through the mesh. It took patience nobody had but everybody made. Today you can buy pre-sifted cake flour in a box. It is not the same. She never owned an oven thermometer. Most of those old wood stoves and early gas ranges did not even have temperature dials, just a damper and a prayer. So she tested the heat with her hand. She opened the oven door, held her palm inside at rack level, and counted. If she could hold it there for 30 seconds, the oven was low, around 250 degrees, good for meringue or warming plates. 15 seconds meant moderate, somewhere around 350, right for cakes. If she pulled her hand back after 5 seconds, the oven was hot, 400 and above, and the biscuits went in immediately. She calibrated this over years, over thousands of batches, adjusting the damper by feel until the heat sat where she wanted it. Her daughters learned by standing beside her, counting along, feeling the difference between a bread oven and a pie oven on the skin of their own palms. When thermometers finally became common, some of those women tested them against their hands and found the instruments wrong. Nothing got thrown away. Not the last scrape of butter from the dish, and certainly not the paper it came wrapped in. After the butter was gone, the wax wrapper still had a thin film of grease clinging to it, enough to coat a cake pan, a muffin tin, or a cookie sheet. You folded the wrapper into a small square and rubbed it across every surface, pressing into the corners where sticking was worst. It left behind just enough fat to release the baked goods without leaving a heavy residue on the bottom. This was the quiet mathematics of a kitchen that could not afford to waste a cent. 1 stick of butter served twice, first in the batter, then on the pan. Some women saved the wrappers in a drawer, stacking them flat, pulling one out every time they baked. During the rationing years of the 1940s, when butter was limited to half a pound per person per week, those saved wrappers were not frugal. They were essential. A pile of butter wrappers was not trash. It was a tool. Nobody in those kitchens owned a pastry cutter. They had 2 table knives. You held one in each hand, blades crossing in the bowl, and pulled them past each other through the flour and lard in a scissoring motion, cutting the fat into smaller and smaller pieces until the mixture looked like coarse meal with pea-sized lumps scattered through. Those lumps were the secret. Each one a pocket of solid fat that would melt in the oven and leave behind an airspace, a layer, a flake. The motion had to be quick and light. If you worked too slow, the warmth from your hands softened the lard, and it blended into the flour instead of staying separate, and you got a dense, heavy biscuit instead of one that split open in sheets. Your grandmother could do this in under a minute without looking. Her hands knew when the texture was right the way a fiddler knows when a string is in tune. But if cutting lard into flour took skill, what the mountain women did with salt-rising bread took something closer to faith. There was no yeast in this bread. Not commercial, not sourdough, nothing any modern baker would recognize as a leavening agent. A cook sliced raw potatoes into a mason jar, added cornmeal, a pinch of sugar, a pinch of soda, and poured boiling water over the top. She covered the jar loosely and set it in the warmest spot she could find, near the hearth, inside a cold oven with just the light on. Overnight, wild bacteria began to ferment, producing hydrogen gas that would raise the bread. By morning, the jar was foamy and smelled sharp, like aged cheese. She strained the liquid, built a sponge with flour and milk, let it rise again, then shaped loaves that baked into dense, tangy golden bread with a crumb unlike anything yeast could produce. The tradition dates to the 1770s in what is now West Virginia. It survives today in only a handful of bakeries. In the hills, where sugar was expensive and sometimes impossible to find, sorghum molasses did the sweetening. Every autumn, families gathered to press the cane. Thick, green stalks fed through a mule-powered mill that squeezed out the juice. That juice was cooked in long, shallow troughs over open fire, stirred constantly, skimmed of foam, watched with the kind of attention you give something that can burn in a moment and ruin a whole season's work. When it thickened into dark, amber syrup, it was sealed into jars that would last through winter. Sorghum went into gingerbread, stack cakes, cornbread, cookies, and anything that needed sweetness. It had a deeper flavor than white sugar, earthy, almost smoky, with a bitterness at the edge that made baked goods taste like the land they came from. The sorghum cookings were community events, neighbors taking turns at the press and the fire, children running between rows of drying cane. Those gatherings are mostly memory now. The Appalachian stack cake was not baked by one person. It was built by a whole community. When a young woman got married in the mountains of Kentucky or Tennessee, her neighbors did not bring gifts wrapped in paper. They brought cake layers. Each woman baked her own thin round of sorghum-sweetened dough, carried it to the bride's family, and the layers were stacked one on top of the other with thick, dried apple filling spread between. The more layers, the more loved the bride was said to be. 7 or 8 was respectable. 10 meant the whole hollow showed up. The dough was closer to cookie than cake, firm, spiced with ginger, rolled thin and baked in a cast-iron skillet. It rested 2 full days so the apple filling could soak in and soften the layers. Nobody frosted it. It sat on the table looking plain, and it tasted like every kitchen that had a hand in making it. It sounds wrong, mayonnaise and a chocolate cake. But the women who baked through the Depression knew exactly what they were doing. Mayonnaise is nothing but oil, egg yolks, and a little vinegar. The same ingredients you would put in a cake batter anyway, already emulsified into one smooth spoonful. When eggs were too expensive and butter was a memory, a few tablespoons of mayonnaise went into the batter and produced a cake so moist, so rich, so impossibly tender that people begged for the recipe. The trick worked because the emulsification distributed fat through the flour more evenly than hand mixing ever could, and the vinegar in the mayo reacted with baking soda to give the cake extra lift. Community cookbooks from the 1930s are full of these recipes, sometimes labeled mystery cake because nobody could guess the secret ingredient. You tasted chocolate? You tasted sweetness? You never tasted mayonnaise? The jar went back in the icebox and nobody said a word. If the mayonnaise trick was about hiding one ingredient, this next one was about keeping another in its place. Every woman who baked a raisin cake knew the problem. The heavy pieces sank straight to the bottom, leaving a dense, sticky layer at the base and nothing but plain cake on top. The fix was flour. You tossed the raisins or chopped walnuts in a tablespoon of dry flour before folding them into the batter, and the coating gave them just enough grip to stay suspended as the cake rose. It worked with dried cranberries, chocolate chips, anything heavy enough to sink. The flour absorbed moisture from the surrounding batter, forming a thin seal around each piece that held it during those first critical minutes of baking. Nobody called it science. They called it common sense, and if you forgot the step, your mother-in-law was the first to notice and the last to let you hear the end of it. Tomato soup in a cake. It sounds like a dare, but it was real, and it was delicious, and for decades, nobody at the table could figure out what made it taste that way. The recipe surfaced in community cookbooks in the late 1920s, and by the 1950s, Campbell's was printing it right on the soup can. 1 can of condensed tomato soup replaced the eggs, the butter, and most of the liquid in a standard spice cake. The acidity of the tomato reacted with baking soda to give the cake a beautiful rise, while the natural sugars added a subtle depth that people mistook for pumpkin or carrot. It came out moist, dense, reddish gold, and spiced with cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. Families called it mystery cake and turned guessing the secret ingredient into a parlor game after dinner. "My aunt made this every Thanksgiving," someone always says. She never told anybody what was in it until she was gone, and by then, the recipe card had disappeared with her. A pinch of salt. That was all it took. You cracked the egg whites into a cold bowl, dropped in a tiny pinch of table salt, barely enough to see, and started beating. The whites whipped faster, climbed higher, and held their peaks longer than they would have without it. The salt destabilized the egg proteins just enough to let them unfold more quickly, trapping air into a tighter, more stable foam. The same trick worked for heavy cream. A pinch of salt before whipping cut the time in half and kept the cream from weeping on the pie for hours. Hill women who made meringue for lemon pies or whipped cream for berry shortcake knew this without knowing why. You just did it. You added the salt the way your mother added it, and the peaks stood up stiff and glossy every time. Some added a drop of cream of tartar instead, which did the same thing through a different chemistry. Either way, the lesson was the same. A little sharpness in the mix made everything hold together better. This one sounds like a joke your grandfather would tell, except it actually works. Between pancakes or hoe cakes on a hot griddle, instead of adding more butter or grease every time, which smoked and burned and made a mess, the old cooks rubbed a raw cut potato across the hot surface. The starch from the potato created a thin, invisible film that kept the next cake from sticking without adding any extra fat or flavor. The pancakes browned evenly, cleanly, with none of that black-edged look you get from scorched butter. You cut a potato in half, stabbed a fork into the back for a handle, and swiped it across the griddle between batches. The trick appeared in rural household guides as far back as the 1920s, alongside other potato uses like cleaning cast iron and removing rust from kitchen knives. The kitchen did not fill with smoke. The kids did not complain about the burnt taste, and the old man sitting at the table waiting for his stack would shake his head every time like he had never seen it before, even though he had been watching that same potato trick for 40 years. When she made a fruit pie, blackberry, peach, cherry, she did not sprinkle the sugar over the top of the filling the way most cookbooks told you to. She spooned it underneath. A layer of sugar went down first, right on the raw bottom crust, and then the fruit went on top of that. As the pie baked, the sugar melted and the juice from the fruit bubbled up through the filling instead of boiling over the edge and burning onto the oven floor. The bottom crust stayed drier because the sugar formed a thin barrier that absorbed moisture before it could make the pastry soggy. This trick showed up in handwritten recipe boxes and grandmother notebooks across the rural South and Midwest, always passed along in person, never in a cookbook. It solved 2 problems at once: the runover and the soggy bottom, with nothing more than a change in the order you assembled the pie. Simple as breathing, if you knew. Invisible, if you did not. And if putting sugar in a different place could save a pie, imagine what mixing an entire cake directly in the pan could do to a kitchen that had no clean bowls left. They called it wacky cake or crazy cake, and it came out of the Depression years like a small act of defiance. No eggs, no milk, no butter. You measured the flour, sugar, cocoa, baking soda, and salt right into an ungreased baking pan. Made 3 wells in the dry mix. Poured vinegar into one, vanilla into the second, vegetable oil into the third. Then you dumped water over the whole thing and stirred it with a fork until it was smooth. Into the oven. 30 minutes later, a moist, dark, honest chocolate cake. The vinegar reacted with the baking soda to create the rise. The oil provided the fat. The water held everything together. It cost almost nothing. It dirtied almost nothing. and it tasted like somebody loved you enough to figure out how to make cake from an empty pantry. When the hens stopped laying in winter, and they always did once the days got short and the cold set in, the baking did not stop. Applesauce, the kind put up in jars every autumn from windfall apples nobody else wanted, stepped in for eggs. A quarter cup of unsweetened applesauce replaced one egg in almost any recipe. It bound the batter, added moisture, and gave a faint sweetness that worked especially well in spice cakes and quick breads. The pectin in the apples mimicked the structure that egg proteins normally provided, holding the crumb together without making it rubbery. This substitution traveled through church cookbooks all through the 1930s and 40s, usually without explanation, just a margin note that said use applesauce if no eggs. The women who made this work had a family to feed and an orchard full of apples, and that was enough. In January, in a mountain cabin with frost on the inside of the windows, the flour was as cold as the air, and cold flour killed a bread dough before it even had a chance. The yeast needed warmth to wake up, and dumping it into ice-cold flour was like throwing a blanket over a fire. So the women warmed the flour first. They set the bowl on the back of the wood stove, not over the firebox, never that hot, but on the warming shelf where the iron gave off a gentle, steady heat. They left it there while they kneaded butter or fed the stove, and by the time they mixed the dough, the flour was room temperature and the yeast hit it running. Some kept the flour canister on a shelf above the stove year-round, so it was always ready. This was the kind of knowledge that lived in the body, not on a page, the sort of thing you only learned if you had spent a winter baking in a kitchen where you could see your breath. Nobody writes this in a recipe. Nobody has to if you were there. Every cake pan in that kitchen had a circle of wax paper sitting in the bottom before any batter went in. She cut them by hand, traced the bottom of the pan onto the paper with a pencil, cut just inside the line with scissors, and pressed it flat against the greased surface. It took 30 seconds, and it saved every cake she ever made. The paper created a non-stick barrier that no amount of greasing alone could match, especially for angel food and sponge cakes that stuck to bare metal like they were glued. When the cake came out of the oven, she ran a knife around the edge, flipped the pan, and peeled the paper off in one clean sheet. The bottom was smooth, flat, unbroken. No crumbling, no tearing, no leaving half the cake behind. Parchment paper rounds come pre-cut now in every baking aisle. But in the 1940s and 50s, you bought wax paper on a roll, and you cut your own, and you did it every single time because you had already lost one cake to a bare pan and you were never going to lose another. She poured leftover coffee into the chocolate batter and nobody at the table ever knew. Not a cup, just a few tablespoons of strong black coffee, room temperature, stirred in right at the end. The coffee did not make the cake taste like coffee. It made the chocolate taste more like chocolate. The bitterness of the coffee amplified the cocoa the way salt amplifies sweetness, by deepening what was already there without announcing itself. This trick ran through Appalachian and Southern kitchens for decades, passed from mother to daughter with no more explanation than it makes it better. Sometimes it was the last inch left in the morning pot. Sometimes she brewed a small cup just for the cake. The coffee had to be black and unsweetened. Cream or sugar would throw the texture off. And if you asked her what her secret was, she would just smile and say good cocoa powder, because the real answer was nobody else's business. But some secrets were not about ingredients at all. They were about knowing when something was finished without a timer, a thermometer, or a toothpick. She thumped the top of the bread loaf with her knuckle, right in the center, and listened. A hollow sound, clean, almost musical, meant the bread was done all the way through. A dull thud meant the inside was still raw and it went back in the oven. This was how bread was tested in every hill kitchen from the 1800s through the 1960s, and it worked because a fully baked loaf has a dry, airy interior that resonates when struck, the same way a drum does. An underbaked loaf is dense and wet, and it absorbs the sound instead of returning it. She never explained any of that. She just thumped it and said, "Done or not yet," and she was right every single time. Her granddaughter tries it now with store-bought dough and cannot hear the difference. The ear for it died with the woman who baked every day. Angel food cake had to cool upside down. This was not a preference. It was physics. The cake was so light, so full of air from those beaten egg whites, that if you left it right side up in the pan, it would collapse under its own weight before the structure had time to set. So you turned the pan over the moment it came out of the oven and balanced it on the neck of a glass bottle, a Coca-Cola bottle usually, because the mouth was exactly the right size to hold a tube pan steady. The cake hung there, upside down, cooling for an hour or more while gravity pulled the structure downward and the egg whites set firm. Some pans had little legs built into the rim for this purpose. But the bottle was older, and the bottle was what your mother used. If the bottle tipped, the cake was gone. You learned to set it on the flattest part of the counter and walk away without touching anything. Patience was the last ingredient. She never owned a measuring cup. Or if she did, it sat in a drawer untouched while she baked by hand. A handful of flour, a palmful of sugar, a pinch of salt between 3 fingers, a pour of milk that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and not a second more. This was how baking worked before standardized measurements became common in American kitchens, before Fanny Farmer published her cookbook in 1896 and insisted on level cups and teaspoons. In the hills, that book did not matter. What mattered was the size of your hand and how many times you had made the recipe before. Every woman's handful was slightly different, and so every woman's biscuit was slightly different. And that was the whole point. You could taste whose kitchen you were standing in. When she died, her daughters tried to convert those handfuls into cups and tablespoons, and nothing came out right. The measurements were in her fingers, and they left with her. In the back of some kitchens, behind the flour canister, beside the salt crock, in a ceramic bowl covered with a cloth, a sourdough starter sat alive and breathing. It might have been 10 years old. It might have been 50. Some families in Appalachia and the Ozarks kept starters that were older than the women feeding them, passed down from mother to daughter like a piece of jewelry, except this one had to be fed. A handful of flour, a splash of water, a stir every day. The wild yeast and bacteria in that starter gave bread a tangy, complex flavor that commercial yeast could never replicate. Each one unique to the kitchen where it lived, shaped by the local air, the local water, the specific hands that stirred it. Gold rush miners carried starters west in the 1840s, sleeping with the jars against their bodies to keep the cultures warm through mountain passes. A living thing made of nothing but flour and water and time, capable of raising bread for generations if someone just kept feeding it. That was the deal. You kept it alive, and it kept feeding your family. You did not roll biscuit dough. You pulled it. That was the difference between a biscuit that rose in sheets and one that sat on the plate like a hockey puck. She gathered the dough after barely mixing it, just enough to bring it together, never more. Then she pulled it apart with her hands, folded it over on itself, pressed it gently, pulled it again. 3 folds, maybe 4. No rolling pin, no pressing down hard. The goal was to create thin layers of fat between thin layers of dough, like a rough puff pastry, without working the gluten tight. A rolling pin applied too much even pressure and crushed those layers flat. Her hands could feel the dough resisting and back off. Cathead biscuits, they called them in the South, torn from the dough by hand, as big as a cat's head, rough and tall and steaming when they split open. Her biscuits rose 3 inches high and pulled apart in layers so thin you could see light through them. She made them every morning for 50 years, and nobody who watched her could ever do it the same way. She knew it was done by the smell, not by the timer, not by the toothpick, not by the golden color through the oven window. The smell. There was a moment, and only someone who had baked that same recipe 1,000 times could catch it. When the scent in the kitchen shifted. The raw, yeasty, floury smell gave way to something warmer, something finished, something that said, now. She would be in the next room folding laundry or sitting on the porch snapping beans, and she would stand up without a word and walk to the oven, and the bread would be perfect. Every time. Her nose had been trained by decades of repetition, by mornings that started before sunrise, by hands that never stopped moving. You cannot learn this from a cookbook. You cannot learn it from a video. You learn it from standing next to someone who knows, breathing when she breathes, waiting when she waits. And when she is gone, the kitchen never smells the same again. Butter wrapper greaser was a frugal technique that squeezed every bit of value from purchased butter by saving wrappers for greasing baking pans. Families carefully preserved the waxy paper wrappers after unwrapping butter sticks, folding them and storing them in kitchen drawers. When recipes called for greased pans, these saved wrappers provided enough residual butter to coat surfaces without using additional product. Children learned early to smooth wrappers flat rather than crumpling them, maximizing the usable surface area. The wrappers worked perfectly for cake pans, cookie sheets, and bread loaf tins, preventing sticking without any waste. Some families stored wrappers in the refrigerator to keep the butter residue fresh, while others kept them at room temperature for easier spreading. This simple habit saved measurable amounts of butter over time, stretching grocery budgets in households where every penny counted. If saving grease was the first rule of those kitchens, preheating the cast iron skillet before pouring cornbread batter was the second, and breaking it meant soggy, pale bread that embarrassed whoever made it. You set the skillet in the oven while it heated, dropped a tablespoon of bacon grease into the hot pan, swirled it until the sides were coated, and poured in the batter fast. That searing contact between cold batter and screaming hot iron created the golden crust that crackled when you broke a piece off. The crust that separated real cornbread from the sweet, cakey version people in the mountains refused to eat. Appalachian cornbread had 3 rules: all cornmeal, buttermilk, and absolutely no sugar, and the hot skillet was the 4th. You learned it by hearing that hard sizzle when the batter hit the grease, and knowing the bread was going to be right. Using vinegar to tenderize meat was how mountain families transformed tough cuts into something approaching luxury without spending money they did not have available. A few splashes of apple cider vinegar added to the marinade broke down tough muscle fibers in wild game and older livestock that would otherwise require hours of cooking. Families made their own vinegar from apple scraps, so the ingredient cost nothing beyond initial effort. The acid worked slowly overnight, penetrating deep into meat while adding subtle tanginess that complemented strong flavors of venison, squirrel, and tough old roosters. Women learned exact proportions through generations of practice, knowing how much was enough to tenderize without making meat mushy. The marinated meat could then be fried, roasted, or stewed with significantly shorter cooking times. This trick made poor cuts taste like quality and stretched limited protein into satisfying meals. Flour paste wallpaper adhesive was homemade glue that hung wallpaper, sealed envelopes, and repaired torn books without requiring store-bought products. The recipe called for cooking flour and water together over low heat until the mixture thickened into smooth paste. The result was strong, flexible adhesive that dried clear and held paper firmly against surfaces. Families used this paste to decorate their homes with wallpaper scraps, catalog pages, or newspaper sheets, brightening otherwise plain wooden walls. The same paste sealed important letters, repaired children's school books, and attached labels to canning jars. Making paste became a household skill passed from mothers to daughters, with each family adjusting flour-to-water ratios based on experience. The paste cost virtually nothing and worked as well as commercial products for most paper applications. It represented self-sufficiency, proving that basic cooking skills could solve problems far beyond the kitchen. Testing oil temperature with a pinch of flour was how every country cook knew the skillet was ready for frying, decades before anyone owned a kitchen thermometer. You dropped a small pinch into the hot grease and watched. If it sank and sat, the oil was too cold. If it sizzled gently and browned slow, you were close. If it hit the surface and immediately danced and popped and turned golden in seconds, the grease was right for chicken, fish, or fritters. Too much smoke meant you had gone too far and needed to pull the pan off the heat. Some cooks used a cube of bread instead. If it browned in 60 seconds, the oil was at around 365 degrees. The knowledge lived in the hands of women who stood over those skillets every evening. And when they stopped cooking, the next generation reached for a thermometer because nobody had taught them what the flour was for. Cooking on the shovel blade was frontier ingenuity at its most practical when families lacked proper cookware or needed quick meals away from the kitchen hearth. A flat-bladed shovel, cleaned thoroughly and heated over open flames, became an instant griddle for frying eggs, toasting bread, or cooking small portions of meat. Field workers carried shovels anyway, making them dual-purpose tools that fed hungry workers during long days away from home. The metal heated evenly when held at the right angle over flames, and the long handle kept hands safe from the fire. Fathers showed sons how to judge temperature by watching metal change color and feeling heat radiating upward. Food cooked directly on the blade picked up a faint mineral taste that became associated with outdoor work and simple satisfaction. This technique required no additional equipment and worked anywhere a fire could be built, making it invaluable for remote work. Potato rust remover was a surprisingly effective tool for restoring rusted cast iron, knife blades, and metal implements to working condition. The technique involved cutting a raw potato in half, dipping the cut surface into dish soap or salt, then using it to scrub rusted metal surfaces. The oxalic acid naturally present in potatoes reacted with iron oxide, loosening rust and allowing it to be wiped away easily. Families discovered this hack when polishing their precious cast iron skillets, the cornerstones of mountain cooking that needed regular maintenance to stay functional. The potato provided gentle abrasion without scratching seasoned surfaces, making it safer than steel wool or harsh chemicals that could damage the pan's coating. Children were often assigned this task, working through collections of rusty tools and kitchen implements on Saturday mornings. The method was slow but effective, requiring patience as the potato gradually broke down rust layer by layer. Seasoning a cast iron skillet with nothing but lard and daily use was how every pan in those kitchens got its black, glass-smooth finish, and it took years, not hours. You rubbed the pan with lard or bacon grease after every washing, set it back on the warm stove to dry, and cooked in it again the next morning. The fat polymerized into a hard, slick coating that nothing stuck to, and every meal added another layer. Griswold and Wagner pans from the 1920s were cast thinner and machined smoother than anything made today, and the women who cooked on them built seasoning so deep you could fry an egg and slide it onto a plate without a spatula. People now buy pre-seasoned skillets and wonder why the eggs still stick. The answer is 60 years of daily use that nobody can rush. That pan worked because she used it every day of her life, and when she was gone, the seasoning held more of her than any photograph. Salt ice cream maker was a summer hack that turned hot afternoons into frozen treat celebrations without requiring expensive equipment or electricity. Families would nest a small metal can inside a larger bucket, filling the space between with crushed ice and rock salt. The salt lowered the freezing point of the ice, creating temperatures cold enough to freeze cream mixture placed in the inner can. Children took turns cranking or shaking the apparatus, watching through patient labor as liquid transformed into creamy dessert. The process took 30 minutes or more of continuous effort, but the anticipation made the rewards sweeter. Homemade ice cream tasted richer than store-bought versions, made with fresh cream, sugar, and whatever flavorings the family had available. Vanilla extract was common, but summer berries or peaches from the orchard made seasonal variations that became family traditions passed down through generations of hot weather gatherings. Using potato water as a base for bread dough and soups was a trick born from the simple refusal to waste anything, and the science behind it turned out to be remarkable. That starchy, cloudy liquid left over from boiling potatoes activated yeast faster than plain water, giving homemade bread a softer crumb and a longer shelf life. Pour it into a soup pot, and it thickened the broth naturally without needing a roux or a handful of flour stirred in at the end. Depression-era families figured this out by necessity. When you could barely afford the potatoes, you certainly were not pouring their cooking liquid down the drain. Grandmothers kept a pot on the back of the stove for exactly this purpose, ladling the water into jars to cool and use later. Bread made with potato water rose higher and stayed soft a full day longer, and the soups it went into had body and richness that people could not explain but could always taste. The water looked like nothing. It cooked like everything. Greasing cast iron with fatback was the secret behind every properly seasoned skillet in rural Appalachian kitchens across the Mountain South. Fatback, the thick layer of fat from a hog's back, was rubbed across cast iron cookware while still warm, creating a protective coating that prevented rust and built the non-stick surface that made mountain cooking possible. Women saved every scrap specifically for this purpose, keeping pieces wrapped in cloth near the stove where they stayed soft and ready to use. The process was repeated after every use, building layers of seasoning that turned cheap cast iron into family heirlooms passed through generations. A well-seasoned skillet required no additional oil for frying and released food effortlessly. Children learned this ritual by watching mothers perform it hundreds of times before being trusted with precious cookware. This simple trick transformed basic equipment into tools that lasted lifetimes and cooked food with unmatched quality. Cornmeal ant barrier was a pest control method that protected pantries and kitchens without toxic chemicals or expensive exterminators. Families discovered that sprinkling dry cornmeal along windowsills, doorways, and cabinet edges created a line that ants wouldn't cross. The theory held that ants would carry cornmeal back to their colonies where it would expand inside their digestive systems, eliminating the problem at its source. Whether scientifically accurate or not, the method worked well enough that families passed it down through generations. The cornmeal was cheap, safe around children and pets, and didn't require any special application beyond sprinkling it where ants appeared. Some families mixed the cornmeal with sugar to make it more attractive to foraging ants, increasing its effectiveness as bait. This hack remained popular precisely because it used an ingredient every mountain kitchen already stocked, turning pantry staples into practical pest solutions. Adding a pinch of salt to coffee grounds before brewing was something the old folks did without explaining why, and if you asked, they just said it tasted better. They were right. The sodium blocks bitter compounds on your tongue, smoothing out the harshness of cheap, over-roasted beans, the only kind most rural families could afford. A quarter teaspoon in the grounds before the water hit was all it took. Alton Brown brought this trick to television decades later and acted like it was a discovery, but women in Appalachian kitchens had been doing it since the early 1900s with the rough ground coffee they bought in bulk from the general store. You did not need to understand the chemistry. You just watched your grandmother add that tiny pinch without measuring, and you tasted the difference in the first cup. The coffee came out rounder, smoother, less like something you had to choke down. Nobody writes it on the bag. You either grew up knowing or you did not. Soaking beans with baking soda was a trick that solved two problems at once in mountain kitchens where fuel was precious and time was always scarce for busy families. A pinch of baking soda added to soaking water softened dried beans faster by breaking down their tough outer skins, reducing cooking time by hours. For families burning wood, they had chopped themselves. Shorter cooking times meant real savings in labor and resources. The alkaline water also neutralized compounds that caused digestive discomfort, making beans easier on stomachs. Women learned exact amounts through trial and error, knowing too much soda left a soapy taste while too little made no difference. The beans soaked overnight in crocks near the warm stove, absorbing water and releasing starches. By morning, they were plump and ready, cooking to creamy softness in half the usual time. This knowledge passed quietly between neighbors as practical wisdom that made survival easier. Vinegar copper cleaner transformed tarnished pots, pans, and hardware into gleaming surfaces using nothing but pantry vinegar and table salt. The method was simple enough that children could help with the task, mixing white vinegar with salt to create a paste that cut through oxidation and grime. Families would rub this mixture onto copper surfaces using old rags or their bare hands, watching dark tarnish dissolve away to reveal the warm orange metal underneath. The chemical reaction between acid and salt broke down the oxidized layer without scratching or damaging the copper beneath. Mountain households took pride in their copper cookware, often passed down through generations, and this cleaning method kept heirloom pieces functional and beautiful. The same mixture worked on brass door hardware, cabinet pulls, and decorative items throughout the home. No store-bought polish could match the effectiveness or the satisfaction of watching grime disappear. Making buttermilk from scratch with a splash of vinegar and regular milk was one of the oldest substitutions in country baking. And it worked because the acid did exactly what real buttermilk does. It reacted with baking soda to produce the carbon dioxide that made biscuits rise and pancakes turn fluffy. 1 tablespoon of white vinegar stirred into a cup of whole milk, left to sit for 5 minutes until it thickened and curdled slightly, gave you something close enough that no one at the table could tell the difference. Before the 1920s, real buttermilk was the liquid left over from churning cream into butter, and every household that kept a cow had plenty. When families stopped churning, this trick kept the old recipes alive. You poured until the milk looked right, added the vinegar by feel, and moved on. It was just what you did when the recipe called for something you did not have and the nearest store was 20 miles of dirt road away. Keeping butter cool in the well was the refrigeration method mountain families relied on before electricity reached rural hollows. A covered crock or bucket containing butter was lowered on a rope into the family well, where water temperature stayed constant around 50 degrees year-round regardless of summer heat above ground. The butter remained firm and fresh for weeks without turning rancid, protected by both the cool temperature and the darkness that prevented light from breaking down the fats. Families designated specific depths for different foods, knowing exactly where to position the rope for optimal cooling. Children were often tasked with lowering and raising the butter crock, learning responsibility through this daily chore. The technique required watertight containers and careful handling to prevent contamination of the drinking water below. This simple system provided what modern refrigerators do today, using nothing but the Earth's natural temperature regulation and a bit of rope. Egg carton. Fire starters turned kitchen waste into reliable kindling that could ignite reluctant firewood on cold mornings. Families saved cardboard egg cartons throughout the year, filling each cup with dryer lint, sawdust, or small wood shavings. Melted candle wax or bacon grease was poured over the mixture, creating compact fire-starting pods that burned hot and long enough to catch larger wood. Each carton yielded a dozen individual starters that could be stored indefinitely in dry locations. The hack solved the perpetual challenge of starting fires in wood stoves and fireplaces, especially during damp weather when kindling refused to catch. 1 pod placed beneath arranged firewood could have flames roaring within minutes, eliminating the frustration of failed fire attempts. Mountain families kept supplies of these starters ready throughout winter months, knowing reliable heat was essential to survival. Soaking wild game in buttermilk overnight was the hunter's trick that every mountain family knew and most modern cooks have never heard of. Venison, rabbit, squirrel, anything that came out of the woods with that sharp, iron-heavy flavor got dropped into a bowl of buttermilk and left in the cold overnight or sometimes 2 full days. The lactic acid broke down the tough muscle fibers gently without turning the meat to mush the way vinegar sometimes did, and the calcium triggered enzymes that softened the protein from the inside. What came out the next morning was tender, mild, and ready to flour and fry without any gamey bite. The old women never talked about enzymes. They said the buttermilk pulled the wild out of it, and that was explanation enough. You rinsed it, patted it dry, and seasoned it. Nobody at the table ever knew it had been running through the hollow 2 days before. Burying potatoes in ash was one of the oldest cooking methods mountain families used before electric ovens existed in rural Appalachian communities. Fresh potatoes were nestled directly into warm ashes at the edge of a fireplace, covered completely until only coals surrounded them on all sides. The ash acted as insulation, slowly roasting potatoes over several hours until skins turned papery and insides became fluffy and sweet. Families learned exactly how deep to bury them through years of practice passed from grandmother to granddaughter. The technique required no pots, no pans, and no fuel beyond what was already heating the home. Children were sent to check potatoes by poking them with sticks, learning doneness through texture rather than timers. The finished potatoes emerged with subtle smokiness no modern oven could replicate. This method fed families through winters when other cooking options were limited and fuel was precious. coffee grounds odor absorber eliminated refrigerator smells, neutralized garbage odors, and freshened musty closets using yesterday's breakfast waste. Families discovered that dried coffee grounds absorbed unpleasant odors as effectively as expensive baking soda, pulling smells from the air and trapping them permanently. Small dishes of grounds placed in refrigerators would eliminate the mingled food odors that accumulated over weeks. The same grounds sprinkled in garbage cans prevented the worst summer smells from overwhelming kitchens. Closets and storage areas benefited from sachets filled with dried grounds, keeping mustiness at bay in spaces with limited ventilation. The grounds could be refreshed periodically by drying new batches in the sun or oven, maintaining effectiveness indefinitely. This hack represented the mountain commitment to finding second uses for everything, transforming waste into household utility. Keeping a slice of bread in the brown sugar jar was one of those small kitchen tricks that sounded like nonsense until you tried it. Brown sugar hardens because the molasses coating on each crystal loses moisture to the air, and the crystals fuse together into a brick you cannot scoop. A slice of plain white bread tucked into the jar released just enough moisture to keep the molasses soft without making anything wet. You replaced the bread every week or so when it went stale, which meant it had done its job. Some families used a damp cloth instead, and others swore by marshmallows, but the bread trick was the cheapest and the most reliable. Nobody explained the science. You just saw your mother drop a heel of bread in the sugar, and 20 years later, you were doing the same thing in your own kitchen without thinking about it. Making gravy from pan drippings was the technique that turned every meat dish into 2 meals and wasted nothing in kitchens where every calorie counted towards survival. After frying or roasting meat, the browned bits and rendered fat left in the pan became foundation for rich gravies that stretched protein into something more filling. Flour was sprinkled directly into hot fat and stirred constantly until it formed a paste that cooked to golden brown, developing deep, nutty flavors. Milk, water, or broth was added slowly while stirring to prevent lumps, creating smooth gravy that captured every bit of flavor from the original meat. Children learned to make gravy by standing beside mothers at the stove, learning exact motions and timing that defined good cooking. The gravy was poured over biscuits, potatoes, and cornbread, making small amounts of meat feed large families. Nothing was scraped into garbage when this knowledge lived in households. Bacon grease lamp was an emergency lighting solution that turned kitchen waste into functional illumination when kerosene ran low or power lines failed. Families saved rendered bacon fat in metal cans, knowing it could serve double duty beyond cooking. The process involved pouring the solidified grease into a shallow dish, then inserting a twisted cotton rag or piece of string as a wick. Once lit, the grease burned slowly with a steady yellow flame that could illuminate a room for hours. The light wasn't bright, but it was enough for evening chores, reading, or navigating dark hallways during storms. The smell was distinctive, a smoky bacon aroma that filled the house, but families considered it preferable to sitting in darkness. This hack represented the mountain philosophy that nothing should be wasted when it could serve another purpose. Many households kept a dedicated bacon grease lamp ready throughout winter months when storms frequently knocked out electricity. Saving bacon grease in a jar by the stove was the single most useful habit in any country kitchen, and the women who did it never thought of it as a trick. It was just how you cooked. Every morning after breakfast, the grease went through a small strainer into a tin can or mason jar that sat right next to the burners, warm and ready. That jar replaced butter for frying eggs, greasing cornbread pans, starting a roux, and softening vegetables before they hit the pot. During the Second World War, the government ran campaigns asking families to turn in their drippings. Rendered fat was used to manufacture glycerin for explosives. But in mountain kitchens, nobody needed a campaign. They had been saving every drop since before anyone could remember, because throwing away good grease was the same as throwing away money. Most kitchens today do not even own a grease jar. The trick did not disappear because it stopped working. Wrapping food in wet newspaper before burying it in coals was a technique that created steam cooking without any equipment at all beyond what most families had available. The dampened paper protected food from direct contact with ash, while moisture trapped inside created pressure that cooked fish and vegetables evenly throughout. Mountain families learned this from Native American traditions and adapted it to their own needs, using whatever paper was available from rare newspapers to catalog pages. The paper charred on the outside while food inside steamed to perfection, emerging clean and thoroughly cooked. Timing was crucial because too long meant paper burned through while too short left food underdone. Experienced cooks developed instinct for judging coals and thickness. The technique worked especially well for delicate fish that fell apart when fried, keeping flesh intact while infusing subtle smoke flavor. Children watched this magic happen at fish fries. Soap Sliver Ball was a thrifty bathroom hack that transformed unusable soap remnants into functional new bars through simple household chemistry. Families saved every soap sliver too small to use effectively, collecting them in jars or bowls until enough accumulated. The slivers were then moistened, pressed together firmly, and molded by hand into new bars that worked as well as fresh soap. Some families added hot water to soften the pieces before combining them, creating smoother finished products. Others grated the slivers and packed them into molds, producing bars with interesting marbled patterns. Children often helped with this project, enjoying the tactile satisfaction of squishing soap pieces together. The practice eliminated waste entirely, ensuring that every bit of purchased soap served its purpose. This hack represented the mountain philosophy that throwing away useful material was simply unacceptable when creativity could extend its life. Pinning a slice of bread to the cut side of a cake with toothpicks to keep it moist was the kind of trick that made you laugh until you tried it and watched it work. When you sliced into a cake and left the exposed crumb open to air, moisture evaporated fast and the edges turned dry and crumbly by the next morning. But a piece of white bread pressed flat against the cut surface with 2 toothpicks acted like a seal. The bread dried out instead of the cake, sacrificing itself so the good part stayed soft. You peeled the stale bread off the next day, and the cake underneath was as fresh as the hour it came out of the oven. This trick showed up at church socials and county fairs across Appalachia, wherever a woman needed a cake to last through a long afternoon of serving. It cost 1 slice of bread and solved a problem that aluminum foil and plastic wrap never quite fixed. Smoking meat in the chimney was how mountain families preserved pork, game, and fish, using smoke from fires they were already burning for warmth and cooking. Hooks or racks installed inside chimneys held meat in the rising smoke stream, which dried and flavored the flesh while depositing preservative compounds that prevented spoilage. The technique required careful attention because too much heat cooked the meat while too little failed to preserve it, so families positioned racks at exactly the right height. Different woods produced different flavors, with hickory and apple being prized while pine was avoided for its resinous taste. The process took days or weeks depending on the size of cuts, with someone checking regularly to ensure even smoking. Meat preserved this way lasted through entire winters without refrigeration, providing essential protein. The chimney served double duty, heating the home while preparing food for storage throughout the winter months. Kerosene stain remover was a powerful cleaning solution that lifted grease, oil, and stubborn marks from fabric when commercial products were unavailable or unaffordable. Families kept kerosene on hand for lamps and heaters, discovering its secondary use as a remarkably effective degreaser. Small amounts dabbed onto stained fabric would dissolve grease and oil that water couldn't touch, lifting marks from work clothes and kitchen linens. The technique required careful application and thorough washing afterward to remove the kerosene smell, but the results justified the extra effort. Mechanics and farmers especially valued this hack, knowing their heavily soiled work clothes could be salvaged rather than discarded. Women shared the technique at quilting bees and church gatherings, spreading practical knowledge through community networks. The kerosene cost nothing extra since families already stocked it, making this hack purely about creative repurposing of existing resources. Those kitchen tricks kept daily cooking smooth, but some of the old methods reached back centuries, to a time when survival depended on knowing what to do with dried corn and a pile of wood ash. Making lye from hardwood ash to turn corn into hominy was one of the oldest cooking techniques in North America, learned from the Cherokee and other indigenous peoples long before anyone called it nixtamalization. You packed clean ash into a wooden hopper, poured water through it, and collected the alkaline liquid that dripped out the bottom. Dried corn soaked in that lye water for a day or two until the hulls loosened and slipped off and the kernels swelled to twice their size. The process unlocked niacin that the body cannot absorb from untreated corn. Without it, families who lived on corn developed pellagra. The old cooks did not know the word. They knew that treated corn kept people well and untreated corn did not, and they passed the method along without ever needing a laboratory to prove what their hands already understood. Using coffee grounds for scrubbing pots was how mountain women kept cast iron and heavy cookware clean without wasting precious soap. The coarse texture of spent grounds provided gentle abrasion that lifted stuck-on food and grease without scratching seasoned surfaces that had taken years to build. Women collected grounds after brewing, keeping them in a tin near the wash basin where they stayed slightly damp and ready for use. The natural oils in coffee also helped condition cast iron while cleaning, maintaining the protective layer that prevented rust. This method cost nothing since the grounds would otherwise be discarded, embodying the waste-nothing philosophy that defined mountain households. Children learned to scrub pots this way before being trusted with more delicate dishes. The faint coffee smell that lingered on clean cookware became associated with spotless kitchens. This trick worked so well that many families never purchased commercial scouring products. Those kitchens went quiet one by one, and the tricks went with them. If any of this brought someone back, leave their name below.